The CSS specifications that we just talked about will tell us how to format a style rule. Style rules follow a very simple format. First, you have a selector, and then you have a set of name-value pairs. The selector will tell the browser where to apply a rule. We'll talk in more detail about selectors in just a bit, but then the name-value pairs that come, they have to be enclosed inside of curly braces. And the names and the values that you can use here, like background-color and #CCC99, those are things that are defined in those specifications. The name and the value are separated by a colon, and then each name-value pair ends with a semicolon. That's because you can have multiple pairs on a given rule. This example is setting not only the background color for the body of a page, but also the padding. We'll talk about padding in the third module. For now, I'll just tell you that that particular setting will push the content of a web page further away from the edge of the containing window by 10 pixels. That's the 10px. The background color, by the way, is specified in hexadecimal RGB format. Let's take a look at how we could ever know this. First, if you go to the w3.org website, you can find something known as a full property table for the CSS 2.1 specification. This table will tell you, generally speaking, the available properties that you can set in a style rule. So there you can see background color, background image, background position. Just to give you an idea, let's scroll down here to the bottom. There's padding, page break settings, all of these are available. If we look specifically at background color, we can see that the initial value should be transparent, and that the value that we can set a background color to can be transparent, inherent, or a color value. Let me click on that. And then this will show me that there are named colors for the web like maroon, red, orange, yellow, olive. And this diagram also lists the hexadecimal codes for those colors. So when you set a color, you can use a standard name, you can use a hexadecimal code, and you can also use what's known as the functional notation because it looks like you are calling a function named RGB and passing in individual values for the amount of red, the amount of green, and the amount of blue to use. Many people will use color pickers to find out what values they want to use. So here's one that I found by searching the web. It's on html-color-codes.info. Inside of here I can select sort of what base color I want and then fine-tune it a bit. This will give me both the hexadecimal value that I can use in a style sheet and also the constituent red, green, blue values, the decimal values that I could use in the RGB notation. A selector is what we've been using to tell the browser to apply a background color to the body of a web page. Selectors in CSS are very flexible and very powerful, so you'll want to spend some time getting to know them. Again, the body selector we've been using is known as a simple type selector. It looks for instances of an element type in the browser's document, and it applies the styles inside to that element. So the body selector finds body elements, and although you should only find one body element in a page, that selector would apply and find all of them. And you can do that with any type, inputs, divs, paragraphs, links. The style will apply to all of the elements of that type that it finds. You can also use an @ sign to create an ID selector. This selector will find an element with the given ID. In this case, it would find the element with the ID of menu. A third selector is the class selector. A class selector allows you to identify elements with a matching class attribute. In this last example, we want to italicize the text in any element that has a class equals book title attribute. The easiest way to understand selectors is to try them out with some HTML, a style sheet, and a browser. I've changed the sample HTML around just a little bit to include some additional elements. So now we have a couple heading tags, a div tag, a paragraph tag, and also a paragraph inside of a div. And we're still applying a very basic style sheet that says find the body and set the background color to #CCCC99. But what if we change the style sheet and said, I just want to set the background color on H1 elements. Let me save that and refresh the browser, and you can see that we set the background color just on that H1 tag. Now you can stack up multiple selectors for a given rule. just by separating them with a comma. Now I'm saying I want to select H1 elements and H2 elements, which means both of those get that background color. Notice there's a little bit of white space between H1 and H2. We're going to come back and talk about that in the third module. Now, through the style sheet, I want to tell the browser to go out and find all the div elements and set the background color to red, green, blue. So these should be all red. And you'll notice that catches both of the div elements. So it captures the div here that's in the middle of the page, and it's also coloring the background of this div, which means the paragraph inside of that div has a red background. Something we'll be talking about in the next module is how style rules are inherited and how they cascade. And we'll see a quick demonstration of that here if I say the paragraph tags should have a background color of, and let's make this red, green, blue, which means if I save this, we should now see 2 green paragraphs. And now what has happened is that this paragraph here has turned green because even though it's inside of a red div, it's the paragraph here that's actually taking up space and making content here. It gets the background green because of this last rule, therefore it renders as green on the page. You can think of that paragraph as having overridden the background given to it by the div, but we'll talk about that more in the next module. Now you will certainly run into scenarios where you do not want to set properties on all the elements of a given type. You want to set properties on specific elements. So I don't want all the paragraph tags to have a green background, only specific paragraph tags. There's a couple ways to do that. For one, I could give paragraphs a specific ID or any element a specific ID. For example, I could say that this is the content paragraph. Now that that ID property is there, I can come into the style sheet and say that instead of all paragraphs being green, I just want pound content to be green, anything with that ID. And there should only be one element with a given ID. But if we make that change and save everything and refresh, you can see that just that content paragraph is green. The second paragraph reverted to having a red color because it's inside of that red div. Another extremely useful technique is to specify styles on elements that have a specific class attribute. So for instance, I could say that this paragraph has a class of quotation. And now inside of the style sheet, I can say that anything that has a class of quotation, and I do that by using the dot, so a pound is by ID, a dot is by class, and let's give that a background color of pound 0000FF. So that should be blue after I save this and refresh, and that paragraph that's a quotation is now blue. The neat thing about a class is that you can define it and use it anywhere. For IDs, only one element can have any given ID, but classes can be anywhere. So I could say that this div has a class of quotation and save the HTML, and now that div is also blue. And again, you might be wondering, why did that div come out to be blue when we have a style that says all divs should be red? Again, that's a topic for the next module when we talk about how specifically styles are applied in those situations where more than one style rule could apply. Although the simple selectors we've looked at are powerful, the selector syntax allows us to use more complicated selectors and more complex patterns to identify elements. One example is the descendant selector. The selector we are looking at will apply to paragraph elements that are descendants of, or that is, anywhere inside of a div element. So the target here is the P tag, not the div tag, and the style will only apply to paragraphs inside of a div, anywhere inside. The syntax is just two simple selectors separated by white space. There's no comma between div and P, otherwise we'd be building a rule to apply to both div and P elements. Another example is the child selector. This selector here is looking for paragraphs that are direct child elements of a div, so not just anywhere inside of a div, but directly beneath a div. It's the greater than symbol that makes this a child selector. You can also select elements based on any attribute value. So we've selected elements by ID with a pound sign, and elements by class with a dot, but you can also say, like in this example, find me all the images that have an alt attribute of spacer, and then set their padding to 0 pixels. Finally, CSS has the concept of a pseudo class and pseudo classes. These are classes that are not explicitly set on an element, but are inherent based on some characteristic of the element. For example, every anchor tag will have a pseudo class of visited if its href points to a URL that the user has already visited. That's just something that the browser will implicitly do. The anchor tag will have a pseudo class of link if the user has not visited the URL. So what we're doing here is trying to say, take all the visited URLs and make their color sort of a light gray that will blend them out and make them fade into the background so that the unvisited links will come to the foreground and jump out with some more color. And by the way, yes, the /* green text that you see in these examples, that is a CSS comment, so you can provide comments inside of your CSS file. We're going to make use of some of these more advanced selectors as we move through the rest of the course. You can also visit the CSS specifications on the w3.org website, and from there you can see the list of all the possible selectors that are available, as well as examples of how to use them. One thing that CSS is not short on is the syntax available to specify property values. This is probably because there are so many things that you have to specify, like colors of a background, the size of a font, the width of a table. Some of these property values are set using dedicated keywords like thin, thick, and larger. You cannot use these keywords just anywhere, only on specific properties where CSS allows them. For example, you can use thin to specify the width of a border, but it wouldn't work when setting a font. When specifying sizes, CSS offers a wide array of measurements. You can use inches, centimeters, millimeters, and points. Point measurements are generally associated with fonts, as you've probably learned when using a word processor, and 1 point is 1/72nd of an inch. You can also specify measurements using pixels. There are also relative measurements like percentages and ems. Ems are quite popular these days because a relative measurement allows you to scale well and allows your design to adapt to different devices. Color codes we have seen, and there are keywords, hexadecimal numbers, and the RGB style that you can use for colors. Fonts have a special case syntax. We'll dig into this syntax more in a later module. And finally, there are a couple examples of functional notation with CSS. Not only with RGB colors, but also when you have to specify a URL, like for a background image. Let's see an example of some of these in a demo. I'm going to switch over to using Visual Studio to edit my style sheet, because Visual Studio knows what can go into a CSS file, it understands the syntax, and it can help me out a little bit if I don't understand what keywords are available. So for instance, if I want to increase the size of the fonts inside of a paragraph, then I know that I want to change the font size, but I may not know that I can choose from extra large or extra small or extra large. So let me just try extra large and refresh the browser, and I can see that the text grows a little bit. And because this is a font, I can also specify font sizes using points. So I could say that font size should be 28 points. That's going to be a significantly larger increase. And I can also specify ems. So an em of 1.0 is the current size of the font for this page. So this should reset it to what it looked like originally. But I could also say that this text should be 1.5 times bigger than what the default size is. So let me refresh this, and we've grown about 50%. I might also want to change the border that is around these paragraph tags. And again, that's something that we'll be talking about a little bit in a later module. But for now, what I can do is I can say that the border style is going to be a solid line around this paragraph tag. And I can say that the border color is going to be black. Later, we'll learn a shortcut for some of this. And then the border width. This can be a keyword like thick. So let me try to save this and refresh. There you can see a thick black border. a thick black solid border that's around the paragraph. And border width is something that I could specify using, let's say, pixels. So I want this to be 12 pixels. I could also specify millimeters or centimeters, cm. Let's try 12 millimeters. But this is a little bit too much, so let's change it back to 2 millimeters. That seems like a much more reasonable border. I can also set the width of this paragraph tag. One way to do that is using percentages, so I can say that the width of this paragraph tag should be 50%. And the answer might be, well, 50% of what? And it's 50% essentially of the parent. That means that in this case, it's 50% of the width of the window itself. But what if I go in here and I say that all divs should have a width of 50%? Now if I refresh the page, you'll notice that this paragraph is half the size of the paragraph above it. And that's because this paragraph is inside of a div whose width is 50% of the page, and its width is 50% of that 50%, so therefore it's about a quarter of the page that it has available to expand its width. If this is not the behavior that I want, I can go in and I could say all paragraph tags do not use a relative unit of measurement. Instead, just set yourselves to 200 pixels. That way it doesn't matter how big the parent is. I also wanted to show you an example of setting a background image. That is done using the URL function in CSS. Inside of here, I could specify the HTTP URL to an image anywhere on the internet. I can also use relative URLs. In this case, I have a background.jpg image in the same directory as the CSS style sheet, and that's where the browser will load these images from relative to the location of where the style sheet is, unless you have a fully qualified URL inside of there. But by putting this here, I should be able to save and see that background image. Now the text here is a little bit too dark. It's not easy to see on that dark background. There's a couple different ways I could fix that. I could come in to the body and I could say that the default foreground for everything here should be white. But I also wanted to introduce you to the star selector, which is a way of saying everything matches and everything should have a color of white. That would also work. If all of these settings and measurements are a little bit overwhelming, that's when you can lean on the tool a little bit more. So for instance, Visual Studio, when you're building a style, you can actually come into the menu, click Build Style, and inside of here, all of these different properties are categorized. So here are background properties, border properties, position properties, font properties, and there's drop-down lists and aids to help you pick things like, do I want pixels or ems or points or centimeters or percentages? In this introduction, we've learned all the basic concepts of CSS. And if there's one important point from the beginning of this module, it was that CSS is about separating content from presentation. Leave only the content in your HTML markup, and keep the colors, sizing, and font selection in your CSS files. The separation will make your HTML easier to maintain and also allow your design to evolve easier over time. We've seen how CSS rules are made out of selectors. Selectors find the elements that you want to affect, and then the set of property value pairs that contain the settings you want to put on specific elements. In the next module, we're going to take a more detailed look at how these style rules are applied to elements by the browser.